That's right. And in a sense, you can say, and also the New Deal reforms in the United States, they reached their...
Welcome everybody. This week's Griscom stream starting a little early today. We're also doing this live on both YouTube and Twitch. So welcome to all of the new people hanging out with us on Twitch. I'm looking forward to this one. And yeah, we're coming for MR. Yeah, I mean, we got a lot to get to today. We were just introduced by self-proclaimed critical theory expert, cultural theory expert, James Lindsay, and his act skills. I will continue to play that video because I find it to be absolutely hilarious. Maybe we'll put it on a little bit later too. But yeah, for people who are new here, a little bit more casual stream. So feel free to jump in and ask questions. I'm watching both chats. And we got a pretty exciting show tomorrow, especially for all of our UK listeners. We're going to be talking with Stella Rooney, who is a member of Unite there in the UK. For people who are unfamiliar, there's been a pretty eventful election in the second largest trade union in the United Kingdom, where not only did an anti-capitalist win this election, but somebody who has a very different kind of theory, moving away from a kind of politics that is only focused and rooted in the idea of, how can we attach ourselves to, whatever the left party is in our nation, but actually saying, we're going to go and build working class power because that's the only way that we're going to be able to get what we want and need. I might talk about it a little bit later in the stream today too, but yeah, we'll be talking with Stella Rooney, who was instrumental and a member of the election campaign there in the Union. So some exciting news in the UK, and I think some things that we can learn from as well. Obviously, we're going to be talking a bit about, Louisiana and New Orleans as they're dealing with the aftermath of this hurricane. Love and solidarity out there to everybody who's been affected. My family was able to get out. They're safe and sound, but we don't know what happened to people's homes and things like that. We're still sort of waiting for that information. But if you can find ways to donate to the different mutual aid groups and community support groups out there, because this hurricane was quite brutal, and there were some exciting takeaways. For example, exciting might be the wrong word, but encouraging takeaways. For example, the levees, didn't fail, and that comes after billions of dollars of, U.S. federal policy, and is another great example of how we need those kind of big government, bold infrastructure programs if we're going to make sure that we have a livable planet. But let's see, and to Quarrel Marks, we'll be getting into stuff like that today. We got some Leo Panitch coming up for everybody. Let me make sure I'm not missing anybody. Eat Vegetables says, no question, just want to support. Appreciate that. I'm always interested to hear what you all have to say and think. So feel free to jump into the chat on both sides. I'm looking at both of them on both Twitch and YouTube. We don't have anything up on Facebook. Sorry, I don't really know how to do that. But Patrick Stevens, thanks for popping in. And Patrick Stevens said, heeded your advice and started Black Jacobins. Favorite quote from James so far: the wealthy, this is a good quote, the wealthy are only defeated when running for their lives. Glad the collectivo workers have their bosses running. Yeah, that was an exciting moment. And it's been amazing. Every week it seems like there's a new successful unionization drive, or at least attempt, that is garnering a lot of support and attention. And I think that these kind of things are really important for us as socialists to be able to sort of reckon with and wrestle with. I know a lot of people, we came into this stuff because of Bernie Sanders and this kind of idea that you're going to, catapult somebody into the White House, and that's going to sort of break the old guard power, and we'll be living under, if not socialism, then at least some form of social democracy. And what we've been realizing more and more is that you have to, you must build that working class power if you really want to have the results on the other side. Bernie Sanders, that's one thing that I know people who watch this show regularly know that I say this all the time. I think he was right when he said that if he came into power, he was going to have to rely on all of us to sort of be out there in the street and fighting for the kind of left socialist policies that we want. But it always felt like, a little a little late there, right? Because to be able to organize on that mass scale, we would have needed to have been doing more party building and party organization than we had. But still, the point is right now is that, we need to start building ourselves up to be able to influence politics, not just in the sense of like having a strong media arm, but actually having an organized and more coherent working class formation. Because right now we're scattered, and I think there's no doubt about that. I think everybody's sort of coming to the same realizations that it feels like the left is very much at a crossroads. And a big part of that has to do with the fact that so many people we don't have those organizations, and we lack that political education. So everybody, we're just sort of hoping, and I was talking about this last week about idealism versus like materialism. If you just are waiting for everybody to have certain life circumstances and for things to line up in a particular way for them to like get it, you're playing a losing game. The point of material politics and socialist politics, the hope of it at least, is that we can break through the kind of like stupidity of all of our individual lives. I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but in the sense that like, there's a lot of people who have always thought that working class politics were just going to come out of like self-actualization, right? Oh, I've been working, I work at this factory, I work at this restaurant, or, I work at this landscaping company. I realize that the boss sucks, and that they have a lot of political power, and are being protected by those in power, and so that's why I became a socialist, right? And look, that happens to to some folks, but more often than not, we get these kind of idiosyncratic understandings of the world around us. It's like, oh well, my boss is he's just a bad guy, right? Instead of recognizing that it doesn't really matter about their own personalities as much as it does like the structure of capitalism, right? And I just bring this up to say, like, if you're just waiting for socialist politics to just happen, because everyone has certain experiences, you're going to be waiting forever. And that's one of the big lessons of the past 200 years, was, Communist Manifesto ends with the great line, like working people of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Now it's 200 years later, and you're sitting here. It's like, okay, well, where is it? And the answer to that question is both really simple and complicated. The answer to that question is it's not just going to happen through people just self-actualizing. It's going to happen through organization and through coordinated political movement, and that comes from political education and from organizing people. So a good way to think about this is that the union is the organization of the working class on the shop floor, and the party, or what we're trying to build eventually, is the organization of the working class on the whole of the working class across the nation. And let me see. I want to make sure I'm not missing things from the chat. Well, Fred Hampton, 21 years old, and had this figured out. For sure. Fred Hampton also did a lot of, self-education. There's a great, I wish I had the ability to just pull up videos live. I don't have it on my setup, but there's a good video of Fred Hampton talking about the need for political education, and maybe I'll tweet it out after. I did a video for Jackman where we use that as footage. You can find it. It's called Why Political Theory is for Everyone. And I sort of break down why political education is critical if you want to see serious socialist change in this country. But I really rely on this great Fred Hampton bit where he makes this argument to folks in his own organization who are arguing. This is in Chicago. Members of the Black Panthers there have this proposal to build a public bank, right? They want to build a public bank in the community, and Fred Hampton looks at the proposal and he says, "Well, where's the political education here? Where's the education section?" And they're like, "Oh, we don't, we didn't have that." And Fred Hampton makes this really astute point, looking at like Papa Doc and other folks throughout history, where you have like the action and the opening, right, where some people take power, they're able to do certain things, but then you lack the political education, so people don't know why they do it. And what Fred Hampton was saying is that if people don't realize that the reason that we want to have a publicly controlled bank is so that we can have the ability to choose what we're financing, we can be financing our own community, as opposed to a big capitalist doing that. Then you're going to have people doing things like stealing from that bank because they just see it as the same kind of organization as any other organization. A similar example of that, anyway. So, and that's why Fred Hampton's like, you have to have the political education. It's just as important as the strategy and the action. And I talk to union organizers all the time, and that's the point that I've been hearing more and more from folks, is that this kind of younger generation is making this push to tell people in their union that, hey, look, we get a better contract than non-unionized workers and all these kind of benefits, and that's great. But also, like, this is our power, right? This is how we are able to get what we want. This is how we're able to expand on the rights that we already have. This is how we have the ability to actually improve the conditions that we currently have, right? And that kind of political education, in addition to the practical education, is really, really critical. Lord Fridas, I'm sorry if everyone's usernames aren't the easiest to pronounce. I have to say, says, this is on Twitch, said, "I wouldn't be so gloomy. I think the younger generation in the U.S. is waking up to the systemic dysfunctions of the U.S. and Red Scare isn't working on them so well." Oh, no, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, that's been one of the cases I've been making for a long time. I remind people all the time that, when I first became a socialist, it almost felt like a kind of little secret that I had to keep to myself and the little organizations that I was a member of. It didn't seem like something that was going to be growing. And, 5-6 years later, we're in a completely different situation. So I think things are positive. I know it can be tough when you have your hopes up, and obviously we need change now. But yeah, I think it's important not to fall into like a kind of gloomy mentality. They also wanted to know, if I would be okay with them shouting. I mean, yeah, put someone's name up. I'm not, sure to check them out if you want to. Very happy to do that as well. Well, let me see, y'all. I know we have a lot to get to, but before we get to kind of like the big meat, and of course taking more questions from y'all, I did want to highlight this piece about New Orleans, and for people again who aren't too familiar with Left Reckoning, one of the big things that Matt Leck and I both are really adamant about and try to push people toward is this understanding that if you want to deal with climate change, you need to be very, very serious about taking control over our public utility, over utilities in general, and making them actually, democratically controlled, and not just in the kind of like nominal sense, right? In a sense that we actually have the ability to influence them and to make them work for our interests, because we've seen, especially when it comes to power production and power distribution and protection of those systems, let alone carbon emissions, that whenever you have the private interests in these organizations, they cut corners and they try to promote and provide a product to you that is as cheap as possible. And they know that if anything gets really, really bad, they can expect some kind of public funding for the repairs. And one of the things that's going on in New Orleans right now, for people who are unfamiliar, in the aftermath, has been massive power outages. And look, these are huge storms. I'm not an engineer. I can recognize that sometimes, system failures will happen, especially in moments like this. But this piece here in Gizmodo by Darna Noor, I apologize, Darna, if I'm mispronouncing your name. You should definitely be following her work. She's written some really great pieces on labor and in the environment. But this is a piece that she just put out this afternoon called "Utility That Blacked Out New Orleans Was Too Busy Fighting Climate Regulations." Entergy's infrastructure failed spectacularly on Sunday, frying New Orleans' electricity grid. It has a history of making the climate crisis worse. And she knows how people in communities have been asking for there to be less and less reliance on fossil fuels, specifically when it comes to power production. And this company, Entergy, which provides electricity to Louisiana, I believe Arkansas as well, and some bits of Texas, has spent a shitload of money actually trying to counter those demands from people in the public, in public, right? Well, I think we just got rated by Majority Report. What's up, everybody? Welcome. Welcome to the Left Reckoning stream here. We're taking questions from the chat. So I'm very, very stoked to be able to welcome you all here. We're talking a little bit about New Orleans and this corporation Entergy, which was critical in basically creating a mass blackout in that community there. Basically, Entergy has known for decades, including longer than almost any of the general public who are suffering through Ida and its aftermath, that burning fossil fuels causes climate change. That climate change causes more extreme weather, that these effects would create vulnerabilities for the electrical grid. They talk about later in this piece here too that Entergy has opposed efforts to get oil and gas off of the grid and to make the grid more resilient. Last year, it announced that it would plan to reach net zero by 2050. Oh boy, by expanding the use of carbon-polluting natural gas. And they also have said that organizations that are pushing, this is from their the president of Entergy, says that the solar lobby is trying to push for a class war. I'll tell you right now, when it comes to energy production, we definitely need much more class war. So I wanted to highlight that corporation, and I think we'll try to be having, we'll be trying to have Darna on the show soon too, because she is a really great reporter. You should be checking out her work. But yeah, welcome to the stream, everybody. I want to start trying to get some questions. I want to talk a little bit about Leo Panitch. I have some good clips for y'all, but let me make sure I'm not missing too much from the chat here. We have we got some things here. Let me see. Yeah, so feel free to jump in with questions in the chat. Happy to answer them. Let me see. What was it called on TMBS where Griscom would do some Wall Street news and their fleece? We call those the Griscom Economic Minute. They were very rarely a minute. Michael came up with the name, and the whole time when I was doing those reports, y'all probably didn't see it, but Michael and Matt were trying to distract me in the studio so I would not be able to get through it without laughing typically. But it was a lot of fun. I mean, I always like to be able to talk about what's going on in the financial world because they really do try to make that stuff they present it in a way that makes it seem like it's impossible for working class people or typical people to understand it. But it's something that is very, very critical for all of us to understand. We try to do a little bit on Left Reckoning, but we've really tried to make a focus, both Matt and I, on covering Native American struggles and struggles in the South as well. Yeah, you got to understand it so we can get rid of it. Well, let me see here, because I have some stuff. I have a pretty interesting Leo Panitch thing that I want to get to, where he sort of talks about the tension between, people who are just full on like insurrectionary, like revolutionaries, and people who think that we can just sort of hang out and wait around and do reforms, right? Because that's the kind of tightrope that I think a lot of people on the left are falling into. So I want to make sure. That we get to that, but I also want to make sure that people in the chat know that they can be asking questions, and I want to make sure that I'm looking for, I really look forward to hearing from you all on these streams. I also want to announce that tomorrow, especially for our UK audience, we're going to be joined by a UK activist, a trade unionist, who is really critical in the most recent election in Unite, which is really inspiring, because what's happening in the unions there is, after the kind of failure of the Corbyn moment, no doubt about it that it was illicit and in a serious attempt at rat fucking and lying and slander from the centrist of the Labour Party. But basically, the unions are trying to make a move and saying, like, we need to be focusing on fighting for working people, and that means building power on the shop floor and expanding the union. And it was a really interesting election, because a lot of folks on the left there really missed this moment. A lot of people in the kind of like London left did not realize how much of the rank and file in the UK wanted something very, very different than just a kind of continuation of being an appendage of the Labour Party. So I'm very, very much looking forward to sharing that conversation with y'all, especially for people in the UK. I'm sure it'll be fascinating. But in the US too, it's showing a different kind of ways that we can do politics. But let me see here. Did you enjoy the Guardian's Elon Musk defense? Yeah. That's just... that kind of stuff is extremely, extremely boring, and I'm pretty much done with the Guardian in general, if I'm being completely honest. Do I have a position on the California recall election? I've just been watching it from the outside, honestly, so I can't, just cannonball onto it. But I must say, it seems like a very weird way to choose to choose a governor, and it doesn't look like it's going to turn out to be a positive thing for the people of California. But I'm very happy. I might need to have somebody on the show to help us talk through it. Well, let's get to this. Let's get to this stuff on policy versus politics, right? And I think this is something that's a really critical distinction to be making for the U.S. left in particular, post Bernie Sanders, because there's a lot of push from some folks, right, who they sort of act like the only reason that we're not living, under socialism or Medicare for all is because there's people in politics who don't have enough will, right? Like, if only the squad were a little bit more rowdy, we'd be living in a completely different, system. I think that that's incorrect. But I also think that it's incorrect, what some people believe, that if we just continue to make our case to the public, that people are all just going to continue to change that people are just going to change their minds, right? That the system itself is going to say, oh, well, you know what? Those arguments that those kind of pesky progressives have been making for the past few years, that Medicare for all is a better policy than Obamacare, you know what? They're actually right. Unfortunately, that's not how politics works. You have to understand politics as from on a materialist level, as a Marxist and as a socialist, as something very different than just like, oh, all of these people are just having conversations and argument around the country and then things shift. No, these things are reflections of political power, right? And the problem that we have right now on the left is that we have a politics that is class focused, right? Which is a good thing in and of itself, right? You're looking out for working people and, and poor folk and things like that, but it's not class rooted. And what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of people in the working class, right, are what I call, in a position of, it's a political pessimism, right? anytime that politics or something has shifted in their life, it's most likely been a negative thing. And most people are very, very agnostic about the potential of political change in their society, and most definitely in their community, right? I'm back here in Texas, in the neighborhood that I grew up in, a working class neighborhood. I talk to my neighbors, frequently about things, and they, of course, they like ideas like Medicare for all, and reducing the police budget and ending wars and things like that. But they don't think that these things are possible, right? I might as well be talking to people and saying like, would you like to just get a free house, right? And that's because I think most people, and it's not because people aren't tuned in enough. It's because they, I think, correctly are making an assessment based on what they see around them, is that there is no mass organization that is fighting for them on these things. The Democratic Party is a disaster across the country, and particularly in the state of Texas, right? So how do we get out of it? And I do these streams on Tuesdays where I take questions from the chat, and sort of trying to work through these issues of like the party and these more theoretical questions. They're a little bit more casual than the main show on Wednesdays at 7. But I want to talk about the difference between like politics and policy. Too much of our politics on the left right now is fixated on these things like, what do I personally support, right? You have people who you come up with a good slogan and you say like, I want Medicare for all, I want a $15 an hour minimum wage, I want to abolish the police, etc., right? And again, it's important to be thinking and to be having these discussions, but there's a real disconnect, I think, with a lot of people on the left right now between these policies and how we actually are going to be able to implement them, right? So there's one group of people who, again, I was saying earlier, thinks that if we just changed wills of politicians, right? If politicians were just a little bit tougher, if Bernie Sanders had, bigger balls, we'd be living in a different system. And then I think a lot of people too, because of what happened with Bernie Sanders, because the media is controlled by major American corporations, and people recognize that they were being lied to, or at least misled about the scope and scale of the Bernie Sanders campaign, there's been this kind of fixation that, okay, what we need is to have a better left media strategy. And I absolutely think that it's important for us to be able to build up our own media spaces, one, so that we can be having these kind of conversations and organizing and talking amongst ourselves, right, and strategizing. But even if we had, like a robust independent media scene in a 2016 moment, I think that the results probably would have been similar if those media organizations were not doing the fundamental work, which is building political organizations of the working class and doing political education. So we have a lot of people who they think that, like, okay, well, what we need to be doing is like, let's come up with the best argument for like Medicare for all, and I can prove to you why it's going to save America so much money and all this kind of stuff. And again, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm not saying it's not important, but it has such a primary focus of a lot of people, and understandably so, because they don't see the organizations or the spaces around them to be able to implement those politically, right? So we just do it conversationally. What do I mean by that? The government right now, primarily the Democratic Party, let's just talk about them for a second. When it comes to policy, where do they get their policy from, right? Is it from, surveying the membership? Is it from robust debate, at the grassroots level of the party? No, because the Democratic Party doesn't operate from that. The Democratic Party has a very big separation between the people that vote for the Democratic Party and the people who make decisions in the Democratic Party, which is the complete opposite of what we would want to be building as socialists, right? So where do policies come from? They come from think tanks, right, primarily. And those think tanks are pretty much bought out by Walmart, and major, and Facebook and major corporations that try to push a certain kind of narrative, right? They might react to us in the sense that they might react to what's going on the ground to make sure that, what's up everyone in the chat there on Twitch? Hell yeah, love seeing Matt's face in there. They like to make this push that, all these people are supporting Medicare for all, so we'll do Pete Buttigieg style, like Medicare for all who want it, blah, 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 right? So again, it's not that it's completely impenetrable to like public support, but at the end of the day, like the kind of debates that we're having amongst ourselves, right, about politics and policy, they're not influencing the people at the very, very top, right? Again, we have the ability to push that conversation, but when we push that conversation forward, it goes through the Democratic Party or the major think tanks that are going to try to, define what we mean by Medicare for all, define what people mean by things like abolish the police, define what people mean by $15 minimum wage. And more often than not, what those people who are operatives in the Democratic Party, people who are leaders in think tanks of Washington, D.C., when they try to react to a public demand, they're going to mediate it, which I mean is like interpret it, and they're going to water it down as much as possible, right? To make it palatable to those in power. And this is why like just advocating for policies is extremely difficult. But at the end of the day, like that's just an analysis of like why American democracy is broken. We have to be doing class analysis if we're socialists. What does that mean? Well, why do the think tanks react in the way that they do to public demands, right? Why do they try to, make a version of Medicare for all or a public option that is palatable to the massive insurance industries? Well, it's one, as some people, rightfully note, they get huge donations from these organizations. But two, because they recognize something that I think a lot of people, even people who call themselves socialists, don't understand yet. That power, right, is political in general, but it's not only held in democratic institutions. What I mean by that is it's not just Congress, the state legislature, the governor, the president who has all the power in our society. In fact, the vast majority of power in American society is held in private hands. And what do I mean by that? Capital. I mean the buildings, the factories, the businesses, and the money and the land. Right. And if you want to do things on a mass scale like socialists want to do, Green New Deal, mass shifts in worker power, right? We're going to come up and we're going to rub up against the power of this kind of entrenched capitalist class. And there's no amount of like correct policy arguments that you're going to make to these people that is going to make them give away what they have. Right. And this is where there's a crossroads. When a lot of people on the left, this is left history here, right? Where you get insurrectionists, right, who follow the Leninist model, and like, look, I'm a huge fan of Lenin, very big, and I don't even mean that as an insult, but I'm just saying like these are two like groups of how some people analyze the present situation, right? Oh well, that just means we need a revolution. Again, you fall into the same problem there, where like you don't have a kind of organization, and you're just sort of yelling these things to yourself, to your friends, right? Doesn't mean that can't change, but that's primarily what that has been. But then you get the other side, which are like the reformists, right? Which think, okay, well, if we just get enough reforms, we're going to be able to, break the system. And there's some problems that have come with that. And we'll get into that in just a second. But before I put on this clip, I want to make sure that I'm getting some chat. So we're putting a pin on this for 1 second, and we're going to go to Leo Panitch, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anything from the chat. Kyle from, Jesus Christ, Kowalski, a Prairie Fire, says, sold some $6 corn a few days ago, so I got some extra cash to pass along. And my ankles, you can be my ankles, buddy. How would Left Reckoning like an in-depth report on agricultural in general and the Midwest in particular? Been a big year. I would love to do that. We've been meaning to get that happening soon. So let's get Kowalski on very soon as well. And we're here with we got Mike from PA folks. We got MR folks. We got a pretty lively chat over here on the Twitch side. So I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything over there. It's good to see all of y'all, and please subscribe to the channel. Matt and I go live every Wednesday at 7. These are just a little bit more casual streams. But here we go. Let's play some radical stuff. Let's listen to Leo Panitch talking about some of these tensions that we've gotten from social democracy, from the New Deal. And I think that where it's going to lead us to is into this really interesting discussion that I've been trying to have much more on the left, right? Because I think that the way that this kind of conversation about the party, about how you want to deal with like electoralism or whatever, has too often been dominated by a kind of like fantastical side, right? Which is more often than not people who like, who make these kind of arguments that like, oh, well, we need the squads to be more radical and tough. And and then obviously, some people who just sort of are holding on to ideas from the past and not realizing some of the real lessons from the Bolsheviks and successful socialist revolutions has been that they are extremely dynamic and not dogmatic in their strategies, right? That's one side. And then the other side is this kind of like, oh, well, we just sort of have to wait and do reforms for whatever. I don't think that that's the way forward. And I think Panitch really does this well. If people aren't familiar with Leo Panitch is one of Matt and I's favorite theorists. He unfortunately passed away in 2020. He is an incredibly influential democratic socialist and takes a radical position on a lot of these questions. He's not somebody who's sitting here and saying like, well, what we need to be doing is hang out with the Democratic Party forever. But he's also not somebody who is just, calling for full on, insurrection and revolution. In that sense, he actually argues a much more nuanced way of fighting for democratic power in society and building democratic socialism. So let me play this video, and then we'll sort of react to it together, okay?
That's right. And in a sense, you can say, and also the New Deal reforms in the United States, they reach their limits in a dynamic capitalism. The regulations on the banks, which people saw as a means of controlling finance after the Great Depression. Well, the banks within a dynamic capitalism through the 50s broke through those old New Deal reforms of the 1930s. So then the challenge became, well, in order even to hold on to the reforms, we need to go beyond them and start taking capital away from capital. Start taking the investment decisions, as I said yesterday, or before rather, of what's to be invested, how it's to be invested, what's to be invested in, into a collective democratic sphere. And that wasn't done. In fact, that was seen as upsetting the deal that these gradualist parties had made with the capitalist classes. Right? They're not going to agree to you taking their businesses away from them. That was even true in Sweden. Right? So far as globalization happened, it happened all the more. The big corporations in those societies were investing around the world. They weren't reinvesting their profits domestically. That was even true in Sweden. Electrolux by the 60s was investing its profits much more in the Italian electrical goods industry than reinvesting in Sweden, despite wage restraint from the unions in order to hold on to that investment. So you're in a dilemma, Paul. What you're identifying is that there's no rapid breakthrough into a new world. But what's also been proven is that there's no gradualist step-by-step reform. It was always assumed that you got the reforms, you'd build gradually, you'd eventually get to socialism, for those who wanted to get there. Most of them gave up on it, of course.
Yeah, and I think that especially for us Americans who we don't have this similar kind of tradition, it is important to actually look to what happened to social democracy in Europe and what happened with the Labour Party, prior to Thatcher and then obviously afterwards. Also, of course, shout out to the Real News. Again, for some of us old head socialists, they were very critical. They're still a great organization, and Maximilian Alvarez has been doing a phenomenal job there as well. But they really kept things together for a lot of us on the left, and when there weren't a lot of outlets that were having left conversations, and let alone conversations of that quality. But what is Panitch saying here, right? Because it sort of seems like he's saying two different things, and I think that this is the kind of tension that we're in, and all I can ask for, and all I'm trying to do with these conversations, is to have us take a step back and start thinking strategically and materially about politics, and not getting caught into fantasy. Because I get worried sometimes, because it does seem like we have a lot of mobilization, but we didn't do the kind of political education early on with our movement, and we also didn't do the Bernie Sanders never brought us into a political organization. A lot of people gravitated towards the DSA, but it certainly was not all the people who were sort of wrapped up in the Bernie Sanders moment. And what we have to do right now is to get everybody under one umbrella. It doesn't necessarily have to be a political party in the sense that it's running candidates, but it needs to be an organization where we can be having these kind of debates. But the first point is that there is no just switch at the top of in the Oval Office to socialism. I talked about earlier how one of the things that Bernie Sanders said all the time is that if he did come into power, he was going to have to rely on all of us to, be able to show up in the streets and to advocate and to fight. To bring people into, to bring his policies into place. And remember, Bernie Sanders' his policies were things like $15 minimum wage and Medicare for all. One, extremely popular policies, but also ones that aren't going to, break completely American capitalism. But they were still such a threat to the system that they did everything that they could to make sure that he couldn't come to power, right? So Bernie Sanders was right that he was going to need that. But one of the things that was sort of contradictory about that movement, honestly, is that we weren't building that. Like if Bernie Sanders were to have won by some kind of miracle in 2020, we didn't have that kind of political organization that we would have been able to do that. And I think that's a real problem, so that we need to be wrestling with. But what Panitch is talking about here is, you can have people who are trying to reform capital and capitalism, and might be very, very adamant about like, okay, we're doing what's called non-reformist reforms. But if you let your feet off the gas at any level, and especially once capitalism becomes dynamic, as Panitch is saying there. So what does he mean by dynamic capitalism? He means, you have capitalism in crisis, and that's what leads to the New Deal, right? Again, the New Deal is a great moment. It improves a lot of people's lives. But it comes out of crisis, which meant that capital was weak enough that, a kind of concerted state action by FDR was able to demand a lot of concessions and demands from capital. When capital becomes ascendant again, especially finance capital in the 70s, you start to see a different calculation, right? The Democratic Party completely breaks down their commitment, to improving the conditions of working people. But again, that wasn't even a social democratic party. In the UK, it becomes quite damaging. As capital becomes more dynamic, a lot of the investments and state control of industries were in industries that were not doing particularly well. And most importantly, the state didn't give workers control of those industries, right? So again, like nationalization can be extremely beneficial, but it wasn't done in a way that was going to make it permanent, right? And it wasn't done in a way that was going to fundamentally change the conditions for working people, and certainly not change their relationship to profit, right? And that was a big failure. And on top of it, that lack of democratic ownership meant that when things got tough, there wasn't a lot of fight left in people. An example that we talk about a lot on the show, and I'm sorry to bring it up for people who watch regularly, but is what happened with Syriza in Greece. Syriza was the coalition of the radical left, this kind of radical party and movement that comes into power and is supposed to fight against European Union austerity. And it eventually fails, and to the power of European capital. And there's a few reasons for it, and I don't think it's fair to sit around and blame them. The reason I'm bringing this up is not to sit around and blame the people who tried to do something different, but is to learn from it, right? And one of the big lessons that we get was that there was not enough rootedness in the working class of the party, right? There was rootedness in the sense that you're getting people to vote, and they even had the ability to get people to show up for mass protests in favor of things. But when it came time to be able to entrench the working people for the onslaught of European capital, they didn't have it. Nor were they able to fundamentally reshape the economy. And obviously, tall order to do that, but we're socialists and we're talking big about these things, and I think we have to realize what the limitations and what the opportunities are and why they ran into limitations. So a good example of the limitations here is like, it's not even something it's not the most radical thing in the world, but I think this really showed some of the problems that you saw in Syriza and some of the problems we certainly would have run into, for example, if Bernie Sanders were to come in power. Was that the education minister in Greece wanted to turn high schools in Greece into what they called community worker centers, right? This is the kind of thing that, people I think in the chat and who are watching this would think is a great idea. And it is, right? Having everyone's community, right? A place where you can go, do political education, have meetings, have political debate, build community, right? It's a great idea, right? It's not something that the state typically does. So to do that, they needed to be able to build new kind of institutions and organizations to be able to implement that. And again, this is the person at the top of the government. This is the education minister wanting to do something with the schools. Well, you know what the problem was? Was that Syriza had so evaporated and brought into power It's people who are directly connected to the party. I mean, like just people who are like party members and militants of the organization, that they had nobody to call in the communities, right? Like they were unable to be able to say like, calling somebody who they knew was a member of this association, that association, to start that process. So it was a top-down thing where the government's saying like, we want to do this radical thing for the people, right? But the people aren't receiving the message or the motivation or mobilization to do it, right? And that's one of the real tensions that we have to understand if we want to build democratic socialism or socialism. Is that it has to be bottom up, not just from an ethical perspective, right, which is certainly true, but from a practical perspective as well, because top-down socialism runs into problems, and more often than not, even if it's able to maintain its power at the ballot box, it becomes entrenched and defensive, right? And that's what Leo Panitch is talking about there when he's talking about, you have all these state victories for social democracy in Europe, right? And you have all these victories for social democracy in Europe, but they're not able to maintain those victories, and they become defensive on those victories because they've lost that connection to the working class, and they feel like if they push any further, they're going to be met with backlash from capital. And the final note on this is that this is another really critical moment of realizing the real power in society, the real power of the state. Is the power of the state is limited to the power of capital, right? And understanding that these arenas are mixed, right? So when we talk about the ruling class in American society, you have to recognize that, yes, they create a unified front at times, but they do operate in different spheres, right? And state power, right? People who are involved in the state operations of the U.S. government, right, are different from industrial capitals and finance capital. And we need to be able to think on that larger term, and also to understand that investment is a really powerful tool that the ruling class has that is not something that is put up at the ballot box. And until we start building a plan to deal with finance and to deal with basically all the money that's out there in society, we're going to fall into this kind of we fall into this trap is the wrong word, right? But our fight then becomes focused on maintaining state power. What I mean by that is like you win an election, finance capital comes at the party, comes at the organizations, tries to punish society basically by disinvesting, by saying we're going to make the economy bad, essentially by not investing in it, by not hiring, right? So then you create economic problems. Like that's a purposeful decision by capitalists, right? And that has nothing to do at the present moment with the ballot box, right? That's the private power, and we have to start pressuring and challenging that private power, because what happens is you come into power, you come into state power, and then there's this whole other side of of society that is still controlled by the private interests of our enemies, and you basically think that you've won the battle, right? But now you're surrounded on all sides, and that's why you oftentimes see this really defensive posture from social democracy. But I want to hear what y'all are saying in there too, because I know there's a lot of folks in the chat. So let me see to make sure. Etymology. I'm sorry, I don't know what that your term is there, friend, in the Twitch chat. But they say, I'm deeply concerned that the left progressives do not have or do not present a robust political strategy from a philosophical and strategic thinking perspective. The left progressives have pigeonholed themselves into an issue-based tactical war. In doing so, the concepts of freedom, liberty, rights, and concepts of the good are left impotent and powerless when the progressive left talks about the future and ambitions. I mean, I think for sure, in the sense that like we're at a moment right now where we don't have the kind of political education that we need. And I've been talking about this for a little while today. But political education, it's not just about, oh, have you read this book? And, oh, well, you should read this book or blah, 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 right? Obviously, that's a part of it, but like that's not the reason that we do it. We do education as a political movement, one, so that we're arming ourselves with knowledge and strategy, but two, so that we have the ability to recognize what one another are doing, right? Like, what's an example of this? Medicare for all. A progressive can make that an argument for why that's a good policy. A liberal can make that argument for why it's a good policy. Hell, people of all different political persuasions can recognize that not having to to pay money at at the site, at the moment that you get sick, is a good policy, along with the fact that it means that people don't get destroyed with crippling medical debt, right? And that's true, right? And that's a great way to sell it to people. But political education is critical on the question of Medicare for all. It's like, why is it such an important thing for socialists, right? Well, one, because it's good policy and it's going to help people out, and we should be advocating for things like that whenever we can. But two, because the power that the boss has over people is in American society today is the power to be able to take away your health insurance, to take away your access to the doctor, to make sure that your daughter can't get her cancer treatment, right? That's a power that bosses have that is extremely cruel. And it's one that they frequently use and threaten people. So if we want to have more labor militancy, we need to take away that weapon that they have against us as a class, right? Like that's the kind of political education moment. And like this is a very practical thing. This is not abstract. Go and read what happened in Bessemer, Alabama, at the Union Drive fight there, right? Remember this? Everyone was all excited about this incredible moment in Alabama where people at an Amazon warehouse were going to unionize, and they voted no. Right. And people sometimes came out as like, oh, this is because these people have false consciousness. They don't understand things. It's like, no, go and listen to what people were saying. And they were saying, I'm worried that if we form a union, Amazon will take away my health insurance by either firing me or lowering the health insurance quality that they're giving to us while we go into this protracted war, right? And people would say, well, of course, the union wants to get you healthcare. Well, of course they do. But people were making a decision there and saying, I think by the time that we negotiate that union contract with Amazon, I will have gone through irreparable harm, right? And look, that's the reality of fighting in America for fair wages and rights. No doubt about it. But do you understand why it's critical, for example, for us to fight for policies like Medicare for all, even though it's not full socialism, right? It's because it opens up that door, right? But what reformists would do is they would win something like that and they would sit on their asses, right? What we're actually saying is like, this is an opportunity to do something that can actually propel us into something else. And I do think that there's a big difference between a lot of people on the left who are progressives versus socialists on questions like this, right? Like I advocate for Medicare for all because it's humane and it's necessary and we needed it 100 years ago in this country. But I also advocate for it because I know that something like that weakens the power of the bosses, and that's why they fight against it so much. And it doesn't matter how many times you tell them it's going to be cheaper for them. They would rather pay the higher cost of private insurance for providing insurance to their employees than not be able to control people's access to healthcare. Let me see. There's a lot of questions here, so I want to make sure we're getting into it. So we got debates going on. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Is it ethical for socialists to reduce their tax liability at the end of the year by you? Yeah, I don't think that you have any obligation to just be donating money to the American war machine. I mean, in a different kind of society, maybe. But things that are available to you as a working person, I think, are very reasonable for you to try to use so that you're not paying, the highest tax rate as possible if you're somebody making under $100,000 a year or whatever. That's a question from the YouTube chat. I appreciate it. It's a good question. I mean, it's worthwhile to think about. But yeah, I don't think that I'm not going to sit here and tell people that they need to be working people that they need to be paying higher taxes to the U.S. federal government when we have all these people who are refusing to pay any at all. Let me see. The real question is, where is the Cold Lone Star in Brisket? It's coming, man. College football starts up this Saturday. I'm looking forward to it. Let me see. Oh, damn. Could somebody send me this? Is this Douglas Coupland's defense of Elon Musk? Is that the piece that was in The Guardian? I can't deal with that shit today. Matt and I did a whole thing on Elon Musk's robot, and I'm sort of Elon Musk out. It's the funniest thing. Whenever we do anything about Elon Musk, immediately our inbox just gets flooded with people screaming at Matt and I for not being able to understand the radical and revolutionary potential of some bloated billionaire trying to ride the coattails of the smart people that he employs. I don't have patience for it anymore. Yeah, hell yeah, hook 'em. I'm looking forward to it. Texas versus Louisiana. It's going to be a good one. I'm going to be very, very drunk. What Marcus wants to know, what do you believe that a post-capital city should look like? I mean, at the very minimum, I think the basic things that we need to be doing is decommodifying housing, separating housing from being something that is a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. Instead, building housing and utilizing the already existing housing to make sure that we're meeting human needs. I want to see free public transportation. I'd also like to see a stronger ability of the people to be able to implement their will on society. What do I mean by that? I mean, when it comes to things like zoning, when it comes to things like highways. A big thing here in Austin, Texas is they're going to build on I-35 is they're going to expand the highway and destroy a hell of a lot of houses downtown in a community and neighborhood here in Austin that is historically predominantly been Tejano and Hispanic as well as Black. And they're doing it on this false notion that it's going to improve traffic. There's a whole bunch of people who understand this stuff better than I do as to why that won't happen. But the bigger problem is the basic question of democracy. What community wants to see their neighborhood bulldozed over, right? This is the state doing that. So it's not even a question of private interest versus government. It's actually having more democratic control in our society. And I think that that's one of the most basic things that we're missing right now in American society. We got a few more questions in here. Are there Elon stands that are socialists? Apparently, I don't know how familiar they are about about socialism. I have no idea where this is going. In the future, cities should have a lot more green spaces and less concrete. The concrete traps heat in the summer and increases flooding that overloads sewer systems. Absolutely. But why does that happen? I mean, it's so many American societies were built up in a kind of haphazard, fast way because we had such rapid growth here. And especially, where I'm from in the South, not just Austin, but, cities and towns all across the South were built up so quickly in a haphazard manner. That they're extremely hot. I mean, have people ever been to Columbia, South Carolina before? That place is a hellhole in the summer. I mean, it's a bowl that just traps all of the heat, and that's the kind of thing that happens when you're trying to do things for the interest of capital, right? And the interest of capital are to do things as cheaply as possible because they always have their oases outside the city. They don't live in the city. How would you rate Austin's public transportation? Every time I hear of a highway expansion, my blood. I mean, Austin's public transportation is not very good. But again, I mean, this is it's tough. I mean, obviously, it's like it sucks, right? There's historical reasons for that, and let's be fair. I mean, a big part of it is the fact that Austin, in particular, has just had insane growth over the past 20 years. I needed to have good public transportation before, but it's like, it's one of those things where you just have like unchecked growth, and in a car culture, in a car city. Unfortunately, it's not very, very good. But the political movements here have been really successful at trying to expand public transportation, passing a citywide Green New Deal, to improve things like that and build light rail and things like that. So hopefully it will change. But it's a hard fight. My question is, where is Matt Lecker? Matt Lecker, I think, might be hiding in the chat somewhere. But he will be with me tomorrow. If people aren't familiar with the show, we go live Wednesdays at 7. Tomorrow we'll be talking about New Orleans, Louisiana, and Hurricane Ida. We're going to be talking to a new friend in the UK, a trade unionist who is critical in their most recent victory there. And about trade unionism and a kind of different way of doing politics, because so much of American I mean, sorry, so much of the left politics right now is this, both in the U.S. and the U.K. It's like, so post Bernie Sanders, right? Post Jeremy Corbyn is, what should we do? Should we do electoralism? Should we do activism? Should we do protest? Should we do unionism, etc. Right? And I think a lot of times those debates they create these kind of false like binaries. But I think one of the biggest tensions has been that there are a lot of people who realize that trying to operate within the Democratic Party is a fool's errand, and more people are realizing that trying to operate within the Labor Party is one as well. But the constant retort is, well, what do you want to do? Just more protests, right? And I don't think that's a fair critique. But I also think a lot of people have not been able to answer that sort of, unfair dichotomy either. What needs to happen is a return to the class, a return to the base, and that means building working class power. All right, I'll put some meat on the bones of that statement. What they're doing in Unite the Union in the UK, which is the second largest union, is a return to not just to focus on questions that are important to the union members, but on a focus on increasing the base, right? So getting more and more people to join the union, expanding on it. And American unions are very, very different. I like to have a good debate on them or a conversation with some folks about them because there are a lot of tensions within American unions. So I don't need to get too precious, for example, about what kind of unions in the United States that we need to be bolstering. But what we need to be doing, if nothing else, is building working class organizations that we can be having these conversations and being able to flex our muscle and build our power, because we just haven't been doing it. So it's one of those things that sometimes it can be hard to conceptualize what that actually means. But that's 100% what we need to be doing this moment. And anyway, this conversation that I had with Stella Rooney, who was instrumental in the most recent victory for Sharon Graham in the UK, somebody who ran on a campaign of saying, that we're not just going to be an appendage of the Labor Party. We're going to be focused on bread and butter issues for unions, and also in building and articulating a working class vision for the United Kingdom, right? That's what we need to be seeing from labor in the United States, along with building the members of people who are members of unions and members of these kind of organizations. And, we're historically weak in that. And there's a lot of people who have been working really hard for decades on that. So it's not one of those things like, oh, people in the union movement in America have not been thinking about doing this. But I'm saying it's like, this is the commitment that we need to be bringing to meet those people who have been doing in this fight for a very long time. Yeah, definitely. Fresh Cow says definitely need more working class power that's not exclusive to politically aware leftists. I think that's exactly the moment that we're in. I mean, I always love to hear I always love to hear from folks who are in my neck of the woods in the South, but also Texas in particular. But I was saying at the beginning of the stream, it's like, a lot of times we focus on these policies like minimum wage and Medicare for all, and of course you got to do it because it's attractive and it's popular. But what I try to remind people of, if you're not from these communities, right? I'm back in my old neighborhood, and it's working class people. They like things like Medicare for all, $15 an hour minimum wage, but they don't see a vehicle to make it happen. So who knows what, you're just talking about fantasy or like dreams that you have, right? And I think that one of the most important tasks that the left has, in addition to the strategic things of like building those organizations, is convincing working class people that politics can change their lives for the better, that organization can change their lives for the better. And that's a hard sell. But it's what we have to do. There's no doubt about it. Because, just waiting for self-actualization is just not happening. I'm sorry. Someone asked why my hair is so dark. Look, I asked myself that same question. I used to have bleach blonde hair as a kid. When I turned around 12, it turned super dark. It's, when I realized how difficult the world was, my youthful blonde hair turned into a kind of classy, stately dark. Eric says, how do you think the middle class from YouTube, how do you think the middle class plays into that? I know Marxists don't like the term, but I'd say the DSA has a serious, a sort of PMC ethos. Well, DSA, I've done a lot on DSA, and I don't want to spend too much time on it right now. But check out some of my other videos. I did a whole thing on like is DSA shepherding people in the Democratic Party and things like that. That's a video you can look up on this channel. Yeah, there's a I don't like PMC as a term. I use it a lot. Michael and I were working on a book together, and like that was like the central thesis was sort of critiquing this kind of PMC way of doing politics. I know what it is, and that's I use it sometimes too when I'm trying to describe something. But more and more, I'm finding it to be used in a kind of, I mean, it's describing culture, and I think that doing cultural analysis is fine. It's good, but it doesn't get us to where we need to be. So I have a lot of tensions of times with the PMC thing, but that's neither here nor there. DSA's recent survey just came out, and the organization is much more working class, represents more working class people than has the DSA overwhelmingly represents working class people on it, and they define that by income. But people who are members of DSA, they have a larger percentage of DSA members are in that kind of working class category than there are at the nation, of the nation at large, and that kind of like upper class people is not very well represented in the DSA either. So I'm just saying, like, those are some of the facts versus some of the anecdotes. But of course, I mean, there's plenty of people in the DSA, and I think this is the tension the organization has had from the get-go since it became something different from what it had been historically, or since it became a larger mass organization versus just a small group of people. Has been sort of dealing with this kind of NGO, liberal leftist to socialist, social democratic character of the organization versus a kind of younger, more militant, more working class, more immigrant, more POC, part of the organization. And these are the tensions that are happening within it. And what I always remind people is like, well, it would be a problem if there wasn't tension and conflict happening within the organization. But I'm sorry, I'm a Marxist. I see everything through conflict between groups of people, right? And what I see within DSA, and I'm not celebrating the kind of nastiness that we see around it, but there's conflict going on in that organization with these kind of things, which means it's wrestling with these questions. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know where else to take that other than there. It's like, yeah, I hear you, that exists, but it's also, these tensions are they're being worked out. They're being forced to. Conflict, man. That's what we need to be watching. Mitchell O'Neill says, for blonde hair dye. All right, we'll see what happened. I want to make sure I'm not missing folks. Hey to all of our Austin, Texas listeners too. I'd love to get a meetup sometime in the future here in Austin. Let's see if we can do that. Also in San Antonio, which is one of my favorite cities in Texas. And somebody from the Twitch chat says that they're thinking about looking into Mr. Potato, Bacon, Egg, and Cheese. Hell yeah, I hope that's your breakfast taco, because that's one of my faves too. I'm thinking about looking into the DSA here in San Antonio, Texas. You should, because also the organization there has had some pretty good success with the city council. That's an interesting. So yeah, there's cool things that are happening there. And again, everything is available for change and for conflict. Let me see. All right, let me get to the YouTube chat, because there's some good questions in here I saw. There's a lot of P. Terry's is better than In-N-Out. How's that for conflict? I 100% agree with that. There's some questions in here about my hair dye. Do not dye my hair. Let me see. There's always those wedge social issues that keep us divided, not to say that those aren't important. I think that avoiding falling into just cultural analysis is critical. I don't know how familiar people are with like Edward Said, for example, but this is where a kind of radical cultural critique can unfortunately undermine movements. This might be a big can of worms to bring up, but people might be familiar with the text Orientalism. Edward Said, did a lot of advocacy for Palestinians. Is obviously a very critical thinker, but there's a reason that he's so popular, because what is his theory of imperialism? And I know this is distilling it very quickly, but that's what you have to do in this medium, is that, the West does imperialism and invades other countries because they thought that they needed to civilize the East and the rest of the globe, which was barbaric and had bad traditions, right? That's why they don't get to have a liberal democracy like we do. That's why the rights of man don't work in that part of the world. And it's 100% correct what Said says, that those were the justifications that were given, that was the ideology of the time. But imperialism happened because they were trying to control the resources and the wealth of those societies, in addition to the human labor and human beings of those society. There was a basis for it, and the ideology that justifies it comes after, right? That is what explains to people why they're doing what they're doing. But it was always, for control of resources, for control of people, for control of trade routes, for competition with other European imperial powers, right? Said makes that mistake sometimes, especially people who follow like Orientalism. It's like, do you think that, to quote Vivek Chibber, who has a very good criticism of Said, I have to say, says, do you think that, Chinese aristocracy were sitting around saying, oh, wow, the Europeans are just so much culturally smarter than us and all that? No, they thought that they were better too. What happened was that, one society dominated the rest of the world, brutally so, and created a really nasty and horrific ideology to justify it. And sometimes cultural analysis makes this mistake of paying so much attention to the culture and missing the class nature of it. So PMC stuff is an example of this too. Well, people are like, well, the PMC is too busybody and blah, blah. It's like, well, yeah, but that develops because they are a class of people who has to use credentialism to be able to compete with people who have shitloads of money. The PMC has to constantly convince people with money to fund them, to give them money, to give them that kind of material power, right? So again, it's like you can make this cultural analysis, and it's correct in the sense that, like, oh, the European ideology toward the rest of the world was extremely racist and imperialist and all of that. But why did it develop? Well, it's not because of some kind of broken soul. It's because there was horror that was being done to other people, right? Cruelty being done to other people, and there needed to be a justification for it. And yeah, and someone is in the chat's asking, what does PMC stand for? Professional Managerial Class. I almost regret even having to bring it up, because I think that debate got quite confused. But we could do it. I don't know. I'm happy to do these conversations, but I think the PMC got really popular because it's fun to fucking talk about PMC people, and like I hate them too. You know what I mean? Like the Warren people drove me nuts. As like somebody who came into, working class kid, went to school in DC. Everyone around me, had homes when I grew up without one. Was constantly having to move around from place to place just to get by. Yeah, I hated those people, and I didn't like their culture, and they pissed me off. But you can fall into a trap of like fixating. It's like, oh, well, they just suck as people, and like, well, that's not political analysis, it's personal analysis, and it's fine to think that. That's between you and your priest or your guru, or whoever, how you want to treat other people. But as political analysis, I think it falls flat. It can be a little cathartic to like blame all the problems on some people's personalities, but I don't know. And again, there are people who have material power who we have to confront, but where PMC sort of lost its way, as the reason I don't use it is not because I don't think that there is a class of people who it represents, it talks about. I was talking about earlier about think tanks, right? That's a PMC kind of structure, right? And their relationship with capital is that they need money to be donated to them to be able to function. Right? That's a PMC function that creates a PMC ethos and class and character, right? So I'm not saying that thinking about that group of people isn't worthwhile. But again, it moved from that kind of analysis to just like cultural stuff. It's like kill the PMC person within your souls kind of thing. And I don't know. That kind of stuff doesn't really work. And then everyone just gets worked up about this idea of whether or not you're PMC or where, I don't know. Well, PMCs are just, to give the term a fair shake, like the concept, this is our breakfast taco friend in the Twitch chat says PMCs are just tools for capitalists, right? I mean, to some extent, but like that's not their only function, right? You remember capitalists, like there are many different kinds of capitalists, and there's a section of capital that the PMC answers to, but the PMC also controls a lot of institutions that capital uses as well. The PMC doesn't only function just to echo the thoughts and desires of capital, but a good example of a function for PMCs when it comes to empire and the state, right, which is sometimes different from capital. I think it's important for us to remember that. The state is a different group of people than capital. The people who operate the bureaucracy of the American state are different. When we did this war in Afghanistan, that was clearly a travesty from the get-go, just on a human level, but also on a strategic level. The PMC knew that they needed to stand up and say that this was smart. The experts knew that they needed to go on CNN or wherever and say, this is a great thing and we're proud of Bush, even though I'm a liberal, right? You saw that almost lockstep. The kind of intellectual class, the intelligentsia of the American society was all in favor for the most part with the war. And those who weren't were thrown out of those organizations or were pushed into mediocre positions, right? Because that's the function of that group. The intelligentsia in the U.S. right now is not very independent from the interests of empire and the ruling class, right? So they knew what to do. Even if they didn't get a telegram or a letter that says, all right, you need to go out there. They say they knew where the funding was coming from. They knew what the moment was, and they basically did what was implied that they were supposed to do. Let me see. And Nathan in the YouTube chat saying, their father might fit many of the stereotypes, and like that's the kind of thing, though, right? Because then you're mistaking like ideology and culture for a class analysis, and that's why I don't like to use PMC too broadly anymore, because I think it got just purely to be a cultural analysis and not the critical class analysis that I was just sort of describing. Well, let me see if there's any more questions. I might have to head out in a second, but I really appreciate everybody hanging out today. A long time ago, I thought y'all were talking about military contractors. That's what I'm saying. It was also one of those terms too, where it's like some people who were tuned into a certain argument were very familiar with it, and a lot of people are filling in the gaps. And Tony says, is the PMC and economical classification? I thought it was largely social. And that's the thing is, it comes from Barbara Einrich, who was making this argument in the 70s and trying to make a class analysis of, professional class people who they're not owners of capital. So they're not necessarily bosses, but they operate in a way that is more friendly to capital than to working people. And they separate themselves from working people. And yeah, credentials is kind of power and structure that they had, but social is political and economic in a sense too, right? Having access to being around money is a very important thing. All right, y'all. Well, I think this has been a lot of fun. I hope y'all enjoyed the Leo Panitch conversation. Let me know maybe if there's any topics y'all like to see us tackling next week during this stream. I might try to do it again at this time. It was sort of nice having everybody pop over from MR. So good to meet all of y'all. If y'all are unfamiliar with me, again, Matt Leck and I will be live tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central. We're going to be talking about Louisiana, Ida. We're going to be talking about the United Kingdom, how to build a working class politics that is not just attached to the main kind of center-left opposition party, but is actually articulating it and fighting for working people, and what that might mean for the left. Both in the United Kingdom and the United States. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And I will see y'all tomorrow. As always, please consider joining us on patreon.com/leftreckoning. We really appreciate all the growth. The big goal that Matt and I are trying to get to is to start being able to take this show on the road. and being able to do a little bit more on the ground reporting. You know, one of the big goals of Left Reckoning is to try to break the left media apparatus's kind of anchor into just New York and LA. I want to be able to go all across the South and the Midwest and see all of y'all beautiful people and the struggles that you're engaged in. Anyway, I will see y'all tomorrow at 7 Central.